A Japanese merchant shows up in the 1930s and they want to do business. They bring over steaming equipment from Japan to what becomes the state-run factory. And they're like, hey, we make this tea in Japan. Check it out. Maybe we can do export business. Next year, war breaks out, but the equipment stays behind at that factory in Enshi, which is today at Bafeng Mountain. So, forgive me, Wufeng Mountain, just kind of south of the city. So if you go there today, you can still see like the remnants of this old factory and production area. And that was the factory work, and the Japanese people left the equipment there. And then later on, now online in China, you can see people saying, well, the Japanese stole from us. There's an argument to be made that it was stolen from Japan, because the year after the Japanese leave, that factory changes the name of Jade Green to Jade Mist to match the Japanese counterpart, which is also steamed and does look kind of similar. So there's a much better argument that they kind of copied at least the name from Japan and maybe actually learned more about steaming from the Japanese. We have no archaeological remains of what steaming looked like here before the 1930s.
Hello. This is Derek from One River Tea. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so in this very special episode, why is that? It's because I finally have a guest on the podcast. It's the first time I'm not doing it just talking the entire time. I have a very special guest, and this is somebody that you guys should know if you're interested in One River Tea, you're interested in my sourcing trips. It's Alex Witherspoon. He's my partner. He's been in this tea company with me, this tea cooperative, since the genesis. Him and his wife, Xiaoyan, the three of us comprise One River Tea. Alex does a lot of the mission work. And mission work, by that I mean what really animates us and drives us, what gives us purpose, the altruistic backing behind, two white guys living in China selling Chinese tea. What we're trying to do, along with Tea Soup and all of my endeavors to understand tea culture and history and connect with the farmers and the people and kind of peek behind the veil of what it really means to be making tea in modern China, the modern Chinese tea market, without that rose-tinted glasses that a lot of people see, like this altruistic farmer just trying to make the best tea. What we're doing is we're looking at human beings in the modern economy, in the rural areas of China, just trying to make a living. And Alex is becoming quite an expert in this because he's been living out in Enshi and Hubei for the past 5 years or so. He's been getting his master's in economics and really focusing on how the cooperatives in their form and function are coming back into the limelight in modern China, in the rural areas, how they kind of fell out of vogue, and what kind of potentialities do we see in this more socialist structured economic development of rural regions in China, particularly with minorities, with really isolated regions. And we'll talk about Hefeng County in Hubei, which was historically one of the poorest counties in all of central China. And it is in this county that we are working with Lo Shuiyuan Cooperative. We're leasing houses on the mountaintop, and we're talking to the farmers and stuff like that, the people who have been living on top of this isolated mountain for generations. And we're trying to do these profit sharings, these solidarity trust initiatives, kind of to create this solidarity on top of the mountain with the people we're leasing land from. And we'll talk about the failures that have kind of come along with that and the successes, because, with any type of growth, with any type of change, there will be pushback. And then to persist that's where real strength comes from. And so I believe we're kind of at that point where we're trying to make something work, and we're seeing a lot of pushback, but we'll talk about that in this episode. Again, Alex just has an incredible breadth of knowledge of the history of this region, particularly with the people involved in creating cooperatives, in bringing economic development to the region again, and we'll be able to pluck his brain for that knowledge at the very beginning. The first half of this podcast will be a little more history, where we talk about the historical development of the Enshi western Hubei region. And then we'll get into the second half is the very interesting story about when we decided to give all the families on top of the mountain 500 yuan, which is, about $100, where the average income up on that mountaintop is about 10,000 yuan a year. And so we're giving them, a solid 5% of the annual income just for practicing their organic farming practices. And so we'll talk about our initial idea of profit sharing from the teas that they're making, the teas that they're picking, and all the money that we're making goes back to them. But we only sold like $400 worth of that tea. And so that wasn't enough to actually do anything. And so what we did is we took a lot of profit from the rest of the One River Tea Cooperative, selling the white teas and the pu'er teas and the dansong teas, and we put that into this mountaintop. And so it's really interesting when you sit down with the farmers and say, you know what, thank you guys so much for practicing organic farming. And we're going to give you $100 if you just keep trying these organic practices next year. And then everyone's like, no, organic farming is way too difficult. We're not seeing any results. We're not seeing any greater, higher value in our products. Like, we're sick of this. We want out of the cooperative. And then just being like, I didn't realize things were so bad, and then trying to talk through it and stuff like that. And so it's really gives you an insight into the truly cooperative spirit of running these meetings, of trying to create this but this tactile, physical solidarity on top of the mountain with a lot of people with different ideas and stuff like that. So if you have any experience with cooperatives, with communes, you'll know it's not a walk in the park. There is a lot of this disagreement, discussion. Everyone gets a voice. Everyone gets a chance to say what they want. And so the second half of the podcast will get deep into precisely what happened on the mountaintop. And the first half is all about Alex's knowledge about the development of the region. So after that really long introduction, please enjoy this conversation, because we start off talking about the origin of the One River Tea Cooperative. We talk about my history, and we talk about Alex's history and kind of what led us to create this company. So without further ado, thank you guys for listening to Tea Soup, and I hope you really enjoy this episode. So as I mentioned, I'm Derek from One River Tea, and I'm here for one of the first times on Tea Soup with my partner, one of the guys who started this whole cooperative idea with me, Alex Witherspoon. Hello, Alex.
Hello, Derek. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to get you finally on one of these episodes of Tea Soup.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it sounds like it's happening. People talk to me all the time, like through Discord and Reddit. I feel like the podcast is really getting out there. So I'm happy to be a part of it in this capacity.
Yeah, and I think you have so much to explain and give here, because you're kind of the one behind the scenes. Like, I talk all about my adventures traveling and sourcing tea, but I think you're doing so much out there at Hubei that very few people really know about. So this is a great opportunity for you to kind of introduce yourself, introduce what you're doing, what's your motivation like, because we met in Yangzhou back in 2017. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Let's see. I think I got to Yangzhou in October of 2017. And at that point, you were already there for a year, maybe 2
right.
years. Yeah, a year or so. And at that point, like, it was my uncle, if you recall, Uncle Laurent, 10,000 years ago, who was like, you guys, you're in China, you need to get into tea selling. You already had been down to Guangdong before that. We're already thinking about dansong. He was my uncle who was like, all right, you're in China, let's do some. I think his idea was to do 70, that's what he called it.
70 was a subscription box, yeah.
That's right. On the 7th of every month, there'd be a special box only available in one shop in Honolulu, or Hilo. So, like, that was his idea initially.
Uncle
I was
Laurent.
like, that's so cool. I was so like excited by that. I was talking to you about it. It seemed like we're gonna do it. And then Laurent's like, oh, nope, too many chefs in this kitchen. I want out. And he got out gracefully. Uncle Laurent, if you're listening. After that, if you recall, for the first bit of it there, we had misadventures aplenty. We went to Anhui, and that wasn't so great. Enough said there. We went to
the secret episodes.
Yeah, secret episode. Oh my god. We went to what's the city called next to Yangzhou? Yizhang? Is it Yizhang?
Yizhang, yeah.
That was
passable.
All right. That was all right. That was like the first that's when we learned, like, okay, if you walk to a place and you just look like you're supposed to be, like carry a book and just be like start taking notes, they'll be like, oh, okay, like there is something to be said here. That was the first time we kind of figured out how to be in that element. That was okay. And our third or fourth trip was here to Enshe, where I guess I just chose to stay. I was in 2018. We first
That's
came here.
that's right. Yeah. So I, naturally, as I've said, like I had the tea house in America, and I came to China with the idea of doing the tea. And so then I interacted with you, and you had your uncle's idea of making a tea subscription box, and that was totally in line with what I was doing. And so I was like, let's try it. And like you said, yeah, we tried it for a good solid year. We remember we had Zheng, is that right? The Chinese guy,
Zhang and Lewis have
Zheng.
been texting recently, but go
Oh,
on,
really?
tell
Yeah.
your
So we had
story, okay.
Zheng in it at the beginning, and we were trying to do all these things. And remember that one big boss you pitched the idea to? We did like a PowerPoint slide with.
Oh my God. You didn't mention Wu is a maniac. So you remember Wu? So there's another guy in Yangzhou, Tom or Tom?
Oh yeah,
Guitar.
yeah. Tom,
So like
Guitar Tom.
Guitar Tom and him ended up getting along great, but like Wu is like one of the most insane human beings I've ever met on this planet. Like he couple of things he did. Like I first met him, he was just like, "Oh, you're doing tea? I shall do tea." It's like he was so confident. I am the one of the biggest bosses in Gaoyou. Do you know where Gaoyou is? And he opened up the
A,
map. It shows me
a
where
little
Gaoyou is.
bit.
Like this is where I am the big boss. And I was just like, cool. I remember he had some great like liners though. Like one line where he's just like, in China there is the white path, there is the white island, and there is the black island, right? And I the businessman must stand between like, these two in the twilight, right? I go to Guangdong and Hong Kong and I work with the mafia. I go to Beijing and I shake hands with the party. This is what it means to be the big boss. So like that was this crazy Chinese, whatever you want to call it, nouveau rich energy.
Didn't this guy melt down one of his rings and give it to you?
Yes. Yes, he did. So this
And
guy
said,
was
"We are now brothers."
still, it was just like insane person, insane energy. We were trying to figure out what we were going to be about and who we were going to work with. And, certainly when I came to Ensha, I didn't want to work with anyone like that again.
And I think here's a few other things. Like one thing that kind of brought me to China was Chinese culture and Chinese tea. And one thing that brought you here was kind of agriculture, right? You did that.
Sure, yeah.
Your undergraduate was in agriculture, and you're very interested in agriculture, and not just agriculture, but communism, socialism, and these sense of cooperatives.
Before I had come to Yangzhou, I had done half a year in Shanghai in the countryside. And I spent a lot of that time trying to figure out how to grow tobacco, which was like kind of fun, but like ultimately could not be a viable crop here in China. I like tea, but to be honest, tea wasn't the driving force bringing in China. It was much more about the countryside, rural development, and tobacco seemed like the cash crop of China. 2% of Chinese GDP, more or less, is tobacco. That seemed like
Wow.
it was the direction I wanted to go into. As I quickly discovered, it is a state monopoly, and they do not need any foreigners to help out. So like that was the end of that pretty quick. But I did end up visiting this commune run by some lovely anarchists in Chongming Island. Like Shanghai is an island up north,
Right.
up in Chongmingdao. And I was like, wow, this is great. I remember like going there in the morning and then like, working a couple hours, getting my labor points enough that I could get a meal, get some
Okay, so
lodging, and
they
like
they were
see.
using labor points up there.
They were already doing that, and
Nice.
it was like a chalkboard, and you could see, who was doing what. A bunch of, to be honest, like these were kids of like bosses. These were like
Mm.
professors. These were like
So
petty bourgeois, if not bourgeois.
retired anarchists, like.
We're kind of retired anarchists, and I remember like the house I was staying at. This kid's dad came out in this like freaking like sweet BMW, and was like, "How's it going, son?" He's like, "I see you haven't done any weeding. How are you gonna do your agriculture?" And then the son's just like, "Oh, you don't understand. Like this is like action, but not action. Like Wu Wei. I don't know how you translate
Oh
Wu
right,
Wei,
yeah.
but he's just like, I'm just not going to touch it, and like they're gonna like." He had some ridiculous idea.
I'm experimenting with the Dow right now, Dad. Leave me
Yeah,
alone.
I'll figure this out. This is agriculture like in a new way, and I'm not sure it worked too well. He's no longer doing it. If you're listening, Bob, nice kid, but like
Yeah.
that kid like quit college to go out to this commune. I think part of the problem was all these kids from like high school and college were quitting to like hang out there as a counterculture scene,
Mm,
and they got in trouble. Like,
by their
kind of
parents.
shouldn't have been doing that, but anyways, yes.
So that was your first experience in China, and your first experience with agriculture in China as well, and that kind
Absolutely.
of drew you back, huh?
Yeah, I went back to America and I was like, I need to come back. I knew that like back to America, let's think that would have been in April of 2016.
Wow. So here's actually before you continue there, let me tell you a little bit of kind of
Sure.
my experience too, because after I graduated from university in 2015 in May, with my undergraduate in Chinese languages and cultures, I have that thing where it's like, what am I going to do? I don't want to get a regular job. And so I kind of started a tea house that didn't quite work out. And then I ended up living on a farm. I ended up living on a cooperative farm with some friends who had bought a bunch of land. And we were just like raising, like 50 chickens, planting beans, and harvesting, doing like CSAs and stuff like that. And so I had a lot of experience with farming as well before moving to China, before, being like, okay, like I want to get to China. I want to kind of make a little more money than just $7 an hour under the table from like hard
Jesus.
physical
Yeah,
labor.
that
And so again, it's interesting too, because that's kind of like right now in China, it's very popular, the saying like laying flat, where it's like people are getting like baoan security jobs after graduating from university just because the job market's too hard and they want an easy job. They don't want one of these hard, high risk jobs where you have to push yourself and kind of make a ton of sacrifices. And so this idea of like the cooperative farm, the anarchist farm, these are, old countercultures for the what's kind of happening now as well. So
Yeah,
fascinating.
and I had seen the I guess the American expression of that in Olympia, Washington, which is certainly a progressive place. I worked at this disastrous organic farm set up by these two retired bankers near
Don't mention
campus.
don't mention the name.
No name will be mentioned, but like I think they no longer exist. They no longer exist. After that, I worked at I will say their name, Latin Cider Mill. They were great to me. Miss Latin was excellent to me. They were a much more successful kind of industrialized agricultural operation, and it was there that I was working at graduation and then after graduation for a few months to earn the money to come back to China. So I was there at the cider mill, and that sucked. It wasn't $7 an hour under the table. It was they do everything proper and nice like, but like, and they I believe they won a national award for their apple cider or their pear cider, one of those two, at the Iowa whatever cider competition. So it's
Oh, great,
reputable.
great job, Alex.
Yeah, good job. No, think Miss Ladd. She has all the knowledge, but like anyways, like Miss Latin was really nice and sweet and old. She thought that I was the son of a mercenary. No, not a mercenary. What do you call it? A missionary in China. She's like, oh,
Missionary.
you're going back to China because your parents are from China, right? And I was just like, what? She's like, she was 89 then. Now
Oh
I'm sure
man.
she's no longer, maybe still around. But anyways, like that experience there at the farm was really cool to see how does a functional farm work, not some
Mm,
like hodgepodge hippie
yeah.
project. Like, what does it take to make a farm work? And it was very much a question of economics. And it was at this point I got
Right.
to meet Peter Dorman, a professor at Evergreen where I graduated. And I was like, I want to do a cooperative. He's just like, Alex, what is a cooperative? And I couldn't answer the question in a good way. And he's just like, all right, you have to go figure this out. And he talked to me about China. He was interested in China, and he brought up like I guess the history of cooperatives and communes
Mm,
in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And I
nice.
already was interested in socialism. So like I guess taking Peter's perspective and then seeing what it takes to have a successful farm, putting these all together and thinking, all right, I'm going to go to China and I will do an agriculture. But at that point, I did not think about tea. Tea was not the agenda. I knew tobacco wasn't going to be it, but I didn't know what I was going to do quite yet. And that brought us together at Shane in October of 2017.
Now, what was that one cooperative you that we kind of looked at as far as like successful cooperatives go? I believe it was Argentinian. Is that right? Argentine?
Oh, talking about Mondragon, Mondragon, like the vineyard with the
Mondragon.
Mondragon. That's in the Basque region of Spain.
Oh, really? Okay.
So
So,
they, I mean, what they got going down in Latin America. So Argentina does have industrial cooperatives. They do have farming cooperatives. Next door in Chile, they have like during the financial crisis, there were all these industrial factories that were shutting down, and then the workers took over. So
mm,
that was, I guess, a big
cool.
deal. But Mondragon is the one that since like the
True.
50s, they're one of the largest companies in Spain. They have survived many financial crises, many changes of political system, and they do a wonderful job keeping their employees employed and keeping management democratic. So that
Wow.
was,
Yeah.
yeah, inspiring to look at as an
Cool.
example.
Yeah. So again, like taking this experience of failed cooperatives, successful cooperatives, small cooperatives, and large cooperatives, and then coming to China with the idea of wanting to do something regarding the
Yeah.
cooperatives. Yep. So that brings us together in 2017. We meet together, find we have like the same ideas, and we find like kind of an outlet for both of our shared passions, where you're definitely more the farming cooperative style, and I'm very much more like the tea and Chinese history and culture. And so that's kind of how we've always kind of operated together. Now we have Xiaoyan. God bless Xiaoyan for doing all of the back end shipping and accounting that we're not very talented at.
We gotta like run this into the ground. Show we're like buying stuff.
Yeah, we would. I would be emptying my bank account every day for this. Like, now we can actually be like, okay, like now we're making some money, which we can use as we have discovered, and we'll talk about later in this episode. We can use the profits for these profit sharings and for these initiatives, and not the other way around. We're not doing the initiatives to make the money or selling tea from people to give money to those people. We've kind of had to figure out different ways about it to make it successful. So speaking of Ensure and speaking of cooperatives and getting out there, I believe it was I first went to Ensure in 2017 because John used to live there, John Miller.
Did he really? Oh,
Yeah,
sorry,
so
he did. He
yep,
did. He
so
did. He did.
he's the one who gave me the tip off for Ensure, and he had a friend in Ensure named Sarah who was, apparently selling tea from a tea farm or whatever. And so my idea was go out to Ensure, find their tea. And so I get out there, I meet with Sarah. She had just had a baby and she was sitting the month. And so
Wow.
for people who don't know China, when you have a baby, you have to stay inside for an entire month after you have your baby. You can't let the wind touch your hair. I believe that's one of the things. You can't wash your hair. You can't let the wind touch it. You can't go outside for like a whole month. And so I went there. She was sitting inside. She was like, I can't drive you around to these tiki gardens, but I can introduce you to a few friends. And so she introduced me to a few friends. They were kind of loose ends. Like none of them had their own tea gardens. They drove me to like the scenic spots. This is in Ensure really well now. So this is in Shuanen. So I went down to Shuanen, saw like the really big government fields. Is that
Probably like
where Zoma? Is that
Wujatai.
Wujatai? Yeah, it
That
was Wujatai.
Wujatai. Like that's yeah, and they've done a wonderful job. I would say like they're one of the places Encher's always like nosy about telling outsiders. So
Exactly. So that's where they told me to go. And so I went down there and I was like, okay, this is great. It's huge, but it's not really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the smaller cooperatives, like the household farms and stuff like that. And so I find another guy who takes me to a smaller farm. It's beautiful, it looks good, and I want to buy stuff. And they're like, oh, well, the government has already purchased all of our tea. And so we can't really sell you anything. And they looked both ways and they sold me like 3 gin of tea, like 3 pounds of tea under the table, and then just like pushed me out the door. And I was like, okay, like this is not sustainable. This is like, and so I essentially left Ensure after like 3 days with just a bunch of loose ends and failed connections. The last night I was in a hotel and I was just kind of, like bummed out, like reflecting on the trip. And I was talking to the guy at the front desk, whose name was Lewis. and and he's just like, hey, if you want to do tea, like let's do tea. Like I know a lot of people, my uncle does tea, we sell tea. And like Lewis gave me the famous quote where it's like my uncle and my family, like they're good at making tea, they're not good at selling tea. Like that's the issue, the disconnect here. And so like I added his WeChat, stayed in contact, and then when we went back next time, I believe we all went back and we met with Lewis, right?
yeah, and that was I mean initially before we came here, like that first or second trip, we were super enthused to work with them. Like, forget about getting a house here. We're talking about
This
getting a
is
house there. This
this
is
is
with
Tao Shubao.
Lewis. This is
Yeah.
Taoshuba. And so this is would be in the Tunbao Township, so just like north of Ensha. And Tunbao is like one of the places in not just Ensha, but like this whole section of the Wulingshan Mountains, which is like the biggest for tea production. And
In Hubei or in Western Hubei specifically?
I would just say in this section of Hubei because
Mm.
like, but honestly, I would be surprised if there's any single township. As a township, I imagine their productions is probably one of the greatest in the province. But certainly in this area, it's number two, only after Bajau.
Okay.
But being out there, it was cool to me because, as you say, the scenery was beautiful.
Mm.
They were right on the road that takes you up to the Dashagu, like the big canyon, big Ensha Grand Canyon, whatever you
Yep.
want to call that. But what really, I guess, like piqued my interest is on three sides they were surrounded by the Magi Village Collective. It's like
Oh.
all of that land was belonging to the collective, and it was beautifully maintained. They
Mm.
had irrigation, not that they needed it, which they'd given up on, but still, it was cool to see they had spent the money on that. They had this wonderful path, which each year we went out there, it got more and more complete. First, it was muddy, then it was paved, then there was a pavilion on top,
Okay,
and
I
the
remember
collective
this one.
did a really good job. Yeah, so everything, like the actual Taoshubao cooperative only has like 6 households, which is like the bare legal minimum to have a cooperative. So they're quite small, but they were next to this much larger collective field, and they were selling some of that tea. They were processing some of it and selling it. So it was like, wow, here is finally our in to what looks like a really reputable cooperative, and they're working with this collective. Awesome.
Yep, and
Um,
I think that's a good point to bring up. Is like this is our first connection with arguably successful agricultural cooperative in China, right? Because we
sure.
met a lot of people in Jiangsu in the Phoenix Mountains who are doing it jia nongchang, like private household style, where it's
Yep.
like one household owns the land, they employ pickers, they employ tea makers if they have to, and they have the profits and they have employees. This is the first time we're seeing actual like different households, different and I believe like when we first talked to Tao Shubao, we were trying to understand it where there were 6 households and then some of it was partially collectivized, where other parts was like, cooperative like incentivized. Is that right?
You know, and I think they misrepresented. Like later on, like once the more I understood how things worked here, like land ownership wise, the more I was
Mm.
like, oh, okay, you guys just buy some tea from the cooperative and process it.
Okay.
Like there's no formal membership with this collective. There's no piece of paper anywhere that says that you had any relationship with the name of the village was Magi. There's no
Matcha.
evidence that they ever had anything with like the Magi uh, collective tea farms,
Okay.
but rather they collaborated. They built this like bathroom and parking lot later on together. And I got to meet one of the guys who was like, I guess on the back end years later doing a project out here, who has been working with them since like 2012 or 11, bringing tourists out there. And like for a long
Okay.
time now, they have had this deal where the tourist buses will stop next to Taoshubao
For a
and they'll get
bathroom break.
out and they'll walk around the collective field. They're so pretty. They'll take the pictures. Then they'll come to the Taoshubao shop to sit down at their little stand. They'll buy the tea,
Mm.
and then everyone gets a piece. The bus driver gets a piece.
Wow.
Travel agency gets a piece. The collective might get a piece. They get a piece. So like they had this like really interesting ecosystem of business that was there before COVID, up until
Uh,
COVID, and then not so much anymore. But
it
yeah,
dries up. And I remember the first time we went out there, they had that, yeah, I would call it like a lemonade stand for their tea on like
yes.
this like really steep mountain slope road that comes right out of the tunnel. And if you're driving through that tunnel, you would probably have like 10 seconds in order to see their stand and stop as soon as you get out of the tunnel. Like if you're driving at a normal speed. And so like I don't see how they were selling tea at all through that unless like people just knew them by name. And so it's cool that they have that incentive with the bus driver with the travel tour and stuff like that to bring people up there, but still.
It worked well enough that they were still able to pay wages to have like shifus come out there, and the wife didn't have to work. The wife of Shang is the name of the guy who runs it.
Right.
Shang Ding's wife could still be a primary school teacher. When I went there in 2022, last year, that was already gone. It was already unviable. She had to come back. They couldn't afford to hire any help at and most of the cooperative households were empty. They had left
Oh
for
really?
the Twinbao township down below. They
Ouch.
were not working with the collective because the collective had been purchased.
Oh
Huazhi
really?
had come in. The Huazhi,
Ah,
which is like
Huazhi.
one of those big, like one of the biggest brands in Ensha. The leader, by the way, now is like already on the what do you call it? Like party committee for
Mm,
Ensha State. We met him a couple years ago, but
yeah.
now he's way up there, and he's coming in now to buy that collective, which is the only collective I've seen in China, which is really doing a good job with their tea production. Historically, now it's going to be gone. It'll be part of the Huaji corporation. It'll be part of their system.
So
And
mm,
Taoshibao expects they will be consumed. because their production has been so poor these last couple of
Are
years.
are they hoping to be consumed?
No, I mean Sean doesn't
No.
want to be consumed. If I understand his meaning right, I feel like the farmers, everyone else of those 6 households, they're very happy.
Yeah.
Screw it. At least this guy will be able to pay, right? He'll be able to
Right.
pay every year rent. He can pay wages. Like he already has expanded from the Huazhe village in Chunbao to this nice spot right next to the what do you call it, Dashagu, the canyon. So it's just
Right.
natural for him to kind of like from two sides encroach and consume them as well.
I mean, again, like this is how do you measure economic validity? How do you measure success? As you mentioned earlier, like the wife didn't have to work, and that was a sign of success. Didn't have to
Sure.
work at the cooperative. And then all of these other farmers that have already left the village, left the fields, and are down in the town, and now they're looking at this like hungry hawk wanting to eat up their land, and they're ready for it. They're there for it. It reminds me of a guy I met in Taimushan, who he had land up on the Taimushan mountain right by the Lushuya, the huge organic corporation, and they bought up his land, and he was just bragging about it. He's like this like tiny Chaosher owner now, and he's just like, yep, they give me like 8,000 kwai a year for my land, and it's very stable. And I'm like, yeah, that's one way to do it, but
Yeah, and I think that's what's going to happen in Chumba with them. So
okay,
so we did not ultimately work with them, not because of this reason, because remember they were always talking about their wild black tea. We are always so excited to go
yeah.
see,
We'll
and they're always
see.
like, "Oh yeah,
They
it's not
wouldn't they
there."
wouldn't show it to us, yeah.
They wouldn't, which like used people are like, "Here's the wild tea, check it out." And one of the reasons we came here to Huff, and we'll talk about it in a second here, is because they were like, "Check out our wild tea."
And
It's
it
not
was
that
real,
wild. It's only
right?
been up there for 20, 30 years. They were so, I guess, straightforward and honest with us. Like, yeah, you can call it wild tea, but really you should call it like wild dead tea, like Huangdiao de tea. You shouldn't really call it like properly wild tea. So they were much more honest. Whereas Tao Bao kind of probably was lying to us from the get go. Probably was no
Yeah.
wild tea. And then the nail in the coffin was one of their neighbors. Like later on, we met him. He has this like little like tea shop downtown in Insha. We were talking to him. We were buying some samples for that Yulu like sampler years ago,
Mm.
2021,
The free one, right?
a free one. That's right. And he's just like, oh, I know Tao Bao, Shang Ding, right? Yeah, great guy. Check out this Sichuan tea he buys from me every year. And we're like, oh,
Uh,
I know this Sichuan tea. This is the Sichuan tea he says is the wild
gold,
stuff.
the gold bud black tea,
The
that
gold bud
wild
black
gold
tea,
bud
which
black
by the
tea that
way, pretty tasty. It's a
tastes
pretty
great,
pretty good tea, but
but from Sichuan, not from
from
Hubei, not from
Sichuan and
Taoshibao.
definitely not wild and definitely not yeah,
Mm.
having definitely
Yep.
not cooperatively produced. So for all those reasons, we kind of moved away from Tao Shubao
Yeah, I
and moved
mean,
towards here.
my strongest memory with Taoshibao is when we accidentally got him too drunk, and he just spent the whole night vomiting.
Yeah,
Just a
he
few
returned the favor. He returned the favor with
with
Phelan,
Phelan.
our dear our wonderful volunteer Phelan, who went out there
A few years later,
years later and got so drunk we had to get out of the car and try to walk back to Ensha, which was
walk back to Ansha down that mountain road. That
we got
that
pretty far.
was that
But
Kill Pig Day or different
that was
day?
Kill Pig Day. That was Kill Pig
Okay.
Day.
Kill Pig Day. It takes a village to kill a pig. If you didn't know,
Yeah, it really does. And if you're lucky, it will not take you. You want no part of that. It is a grueling process if you've ever seen a pig die. Or if you haven't, don't.
avoid it. Yeah,
Yeah, please
please.
avoid that.
So this is cool. So this is showing our trajectory where it's like the failed connections, and then eventually, like slowly as we're doing it, we get a little better at sussing people out, at finding the right connections, at getting more connected, and finding the path we want to go. So you eventually moved to Ensure, and I think it wasn't just because of Tao Shu Bao, but it was because of the proliferation of a lot of cooperatives in the area. Like this is the heart and center of like central China, where we're seeing a lot of this agricultural cooperatives working. Because I believe like Huazhe wasn't Huazhe at one point a
Quadra
cooperative?
is to this day I think, at least provincial, maybe national level model cooperative. So Quadra
You
was
used a
initially
you used
cooperative.
corporation earlier. Why did you do that?
They have a corporate. They have both. They are
Okay.
both. They're both a corporation and they are a cooperative. So the guy in question, oh, what's his name? I think his name is Leo something. He goes out and about in the 90s and makes boatloads of money. I've never figured out what exactly he was up to, but he made a lot of money and then he brought it back to Huazhe village where he's from. So it's the cooperative. This is before, by the way. So in China, what we call now like the professional farmer cooperative, that doesn't start until 2006 or seven.
Oh,
So when
really?
that legal form begins, that was much later. 1990s, it was still either, well, we would call them in English like joint stock companies, like joint stock
Okay.
cooperatives, and these township village enterprises. So it's technically collective. Either it would be collective or it'd be joint stock at this point. Uh, the marketing cooperatives, which there's still one here in Hefeng, if you ever come out here, uh, those were dying. Like marketing cooperative, which kind of like took off in the early 80s. Like there's nearby in Jingzhou City, there's this place, Misha, where I did a bunch of
Okay.
survey work. And for like 7 years, their cooperative marketing cooperative was making like millions of RMB. They were
Wait.
making like incredible money in the 80s. Those were already falling apart by the early 1990s with structural reform because lots of folks realized like, I have all these skills and resources, and I could just take them on the black market, or I could just go to a big city. And then all these kind of like efforts to industrialize locally, industrialize within a village, industrialize within a township kind of fell apart. And the marketing cooperatives were dead mostly by the end of the 1990s. The one I'm mentioning in Hubei, which is like that $1 million one, they couldn't pay their employees for like 3 years at the end of that. And then were completely insolvent to the point where the government had to step in and say, all right, you guys are done, and just deleted them in 2002. So those had fallen apart. So he was coming in at a time where structurally in China things were very loose.
Okay.
And he comes in and he starts renting, not buying, renting out some of the land there at a time where they weren't really sure if they were okay with renting land in China. In
Right.
1983, China started something called the agricultural tax system. What that means is, whereas before you're in the commune or you're in your village, and then like we're gonna work together, we're gonna have like certain goals as a township, and we're gonna produce that, and we're gonna sell that to the government, and we'll be compensated for it.
Mm.
Under the tax system, the government comes in and says, we're gonna take a certain amount of tea or take a certain amount of grain uncompensated. The Chinese
Oh,
government was in a lot of financial trouble at the time, and they basically said to all these local governments, you need to go get revenue. And the way they did it in the 90s was they went to the villagers and
mm.
they basically took uncompensated tax, which had a disastrous impact on agriculture in China in the 1990s. They were already struggling, after the commune was done. There was really no organization, there was no cooperatives, there was no corporations who were renting land. It was all single households. You have 5 mu, I have 10 mu, he has 1 mu. And it was hard to really make that work. You couldn't make any economy of scale. Now the government's coming in and trying to take tax.
And so at that time, you're not allowed to lease out your own land, right?
It was already happening. It was
But
already
but
happening.
it's
But it's like
technically
it's
illegal.
technically against the rules. But here's the
Yeah.
thing: the local government, they want that tax. They want that
Exactly.
uncompensated expropriation. So they're actually happy when they see these companies come in. They call them the Longtou like the fountainhead companies who are coming in the early 90s to start doing these enterprises because they can make revenue. And this
Right.
revenue could be used to help the farmers pay their tax quotas. So he's coming in at the very beginning of that institutional mess in China, and he's doing a good job. The tea is working, the tea is selling. He goes down to Ensha. At the time, there was no Selenium Tea Academy. He goes down to like the local technical school and finds the old professor of Ensha Tea, and then he like baishas, he like becomes like his like pupil or whatever.
Oh, really?
Learn allegedly, it's written in a book. Allegedly, he becomes like a student of Ensha Yulu, allegedly, and then brings it back to Huazhe and becomes, the second or third producer in Ensha to kind of try to bring back the steamed production method. So
Okay,
that's the way it
fascinating.
goes.
And so I want to kind of go back real quick and clarify a few things. So like you mentioned the agricultural tax in the 80s, right?
93, I think it started in 93.
93. Okay. And then during that time, as we mentioned, like a lot of people have 5 mu of land. Weren't there certain types of land reforms where the government took all the land and then redistributed it?
So at this point, stepping back for a second. So everywhere in Ensha and most of the country was under the commune system in the 60s, right? So
Right.
every township becomes a commune. Every village became a production brigade. And then what we now
Okay.
call like the shaozu, like the teams, these were at the time called production teams. So there was this kind of three-tiered system where all land was collectivized. And that was true in Ensha, it was true in Guangdong, it was true almost everywhere. That ends at different times between 1979, 1984. Gradually, everywhere splits up.
Mhm.
But they don't split up entirely, especially in Ensha. Ensha, for example, many schools still, to this day, the university in Ensha still runs a collective tea farm to this day. So,
Really?
like, not all collectives, it's a mess, but you can go see it. Not all tea farms were broken up collectively. And especially for factories, because you need a certain scale to make machinery be a wise investment. So especially if you want to do like Ensha Yulu, or at the time the big thing was actually black tea. If you want to make
Right.
Hongcha thing, you kind of need a certain scale of production. To this day, you cannot do a run of red tea without like 20 jin of dry leaves. That's like
Which is what we
80.
found out about, yeah.
Yeah, as we learned through practice, like, oh, you need a lot of tea to actually make red tea work. You have to make a pile. So consequently, there were still these collective enterprises. So, okay, we're done with the commune, great. But each village and each township, right, the productive brigade now becomes back to a village. The commune now goes back to becoming a township. They are still keeping the factories. It's hard. How do you divide a factory among all these people? You can divide the fields, and they did. Each field was graded A, B, D. I think even like A, B, C, D. So like different fields were graded for the quality of soil, ease of
Mm.
access, and they were divided up. But
Okay.
the problem with that is like maybe one village has a lot of like level A and a little bit of level D. How do you fairly distribute it, right? No one wants level D. So what they end up doing is like, all right, everyone gets a chunk of level A, everyone gets a chunk of level B, everyone gets a chunk of level D. So
And
you have a field here, there, over
this is
there, beyond that ridge. And it was
this is precisely what we saw in Guangdong in the Phoenix Mountains, like with Wei. And we're
sure.
like, Wei is like, yeah, I have a plot here, I have a plot here, and a plot here, and a plot here. And I'm like, really? Like, why are they so like disjointed? And he's like, well, this is just when they split up the land, this is how they did it.
And you know what? Honestly, that's a fair way to do it. At
Exactly,
the
yeah.
time, the slogan was, okay, 现在的分水了更好的桶. We're gonna break up now, but breaking up now is because in 5, 10, 20 years, we're gonna recollectivize better.
That was the
We have the
idea.
market to help us out. So at the time, we're gonna break it up now. This is kind of a mess, but don't worry, we're gonna put the pieces back together in a better way.
But the second coming never came, did it?
Second coming never quite came. So imagine, like, you're in the 80s, the factory is still collectively operated. You have a bizarre relationship with them. Now, at the end of the 80s, at this point, most of those collective factories fallen apart because all of these skilled laborers in the collective factories who are getting labor points or meager wage. Again, if you work in a collective, you have to justify your wage democratically. Everyone has to have a
Yeah,
meeting and
labor
say,
points. Yeah.
labor, or even at this point, they were still like, especially for industrial enterprises, they would usually just do like a wage scale, one,
Wage
two, three,
scale.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like eight levels. But you still have to democratically go through this process. Like talking to
Every month.
Fred up in Beijing, who worked in a guy who was a Red Guard back in the 60s and worked in one of these factories. He was telling me like at the time, you come together every year and decide who's going to be like leveled up, so to speak. And it was a messy process, and it usually wasn't very fair. You would see, okay, who has the most children? Who maybe is not a very good worker, but they have a good spirit. It was not a very scientific management process. But regardless, it was a slow process. It was a democratic process. And these skilled workers thought, you know what? I'm going to go open a private factory, or I'm going to go join someone who's opened one. I can get whatever wage the market wants to give me. Not democratic, not they get that wage increase now. So also the really talented tea makers were already leaving these collective enterprises in the mid 80s, even here in Ensha, and they were starting to fall apart. And they were largely dead by the 90s. When Huazhi and others were just starting to figure out, okay, what comes next? So these are all falling apart, mid 80s to the mid 90s. And on top of that, whereas in some villages they had something called the two field system, which meant that the village was allowed to keep a certain amount of land collective. 97, the government says no more. No more of that, because they were worried. And here's the rationale. There's a rationale to it. They were worried that the collective leaders were using that as a source of corruption, where actually they were taking that like collective land and renting it out to a boss and then giving none of the proceeds to the villagers. That was already so corrupt that like the government could no longer trust collective enterprises to be run successfully, and you've lost all your talent. And the farmers are kind of pissed at you because they have no real leverage in this organization anymore. It's run by the village, it's run by the township, but the actual picking, that doesn't get labor points. You aren't getting compensated for anything more than just like you would now selling your tea to a cooperative or selling your tea to a company.
And this is at the same time the government's coming in, the villages are coming in and taking unrequited taxes, right?
Yeah, that was a little bit later, because this whole system of mess, and the government is bloating through all this. So like as you know, there were all these redundant institutions left over from the commune period. Now the government's trying to come in and like kind of reassert itself in a new way. So you got all these redundant government branches, and government's expending explodes. Whereas before, democratic management honestly is low cost. It's inefficient, but it's low cost. You have a meeting, you democratically decide what you're going to do, what the standard's going to be. Now you need people to come in and enforce from above. You need to pay people to be kind of like your agents of enforcement.
Like cadres,
cadres, right? That kind of management is more costly. And to have this top-down apparatus, and it kind of works for a while, but in the late 80s, early 90s, China, as you know, with the West, bad relationship, the economy is kind of struggling. There was horrible inflation crisis. The government says, okay, we can't deal with this anymore. Local governments, if you can't pay for your government employees, too bad, cut them loose. We can't. We're not going to come in and pick up the tab anymore. And that was the impetus for these taxes.
Okay.
That was the real driving factor, 92, 93. And then that goes on until about 2004. But something positive about this was village collectives had some amount of money. If a collective wanted to operate their fields well, they could. And some of them did. But after 2004, done. After 2004, if a village leader wants to organize collective work, they have to pay each farmer, I think it's 60 RMB at least, at the wugong fei, like the delay your work fee, because the idea is they already have work outside in the private sector. Collective is some outside obligation, and it's really hard to make it work today after 2004.
So that 2004 legislation just crushed the collective spirit, huh?
Yeah, well, I mean, spirit was long gone, but like it certainly crushed like the organizational form, financially speaking. Already in the late 1990s, banks were given the directive like, don't give them money.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because
collectives.
For collectives, for the TVEs is the fancy name for it, a township village enterprise, because they had such a bad record in the early 90s of like taking a bunch of money out from the banks and then misappropriating
bailing,
and then bailing. It's like the leader is like, he fucks off to America. He bailed.
Oh, wow.
Right here. Like he
take
bails,
take the money and run. Like
take the money and run. He paulus. Or like or he just does a terrible job managing it and says, what are you gonna do? It's a TVA. I'm the government. I am the government. What are you going to do? So banks were already sick of them in the late 90s. They couldn't get a loan to do anything already. 2004, they couldn't organize labor.
So that spells the death of the collective. What about the rise of cooperatives? What about the rise of cooperatives we see in the area?
Okay, so in the 90s, again, there are all these different forms going around. There's the joint stock cooperative, there are TVs we just talked about, and then there are these private companies that come in and start leasing the land, especially in Zhejiang province, Guangdong province, rural Beijing. And the government likes what they see. They do. But it's politically contentious and confusing, because it's just like, oh, okay, like, so about that, like, recollectivization, I guess we're not going to do that. And instead, corporations are going to come in and take over agriculture. Like, how do we feel about that?
So, but this is like
really, go on.
So this is Huazhi, right? Huazhi is doing this at this time.
He's exactly that. Here's a rich guy who's come back to his home village and thinks, okay, how do we make agriculture better?
And then in the words of Wu, where it's like you stand in the light and you deal business in the shadows. Like you kind of have to find
Yeah,
the right of both sides, where it's like tell the government like this is how we make profit, this is how we make money and can pay your taxes and stuff like that.
yeah.
But you have to let me kind of do this in the shadows.
I am the boss. I am the boss. This is what we're doing this, and yeah, and it works out for him. Ensha a bit later, so in 2003, four, right as the collectives are falling apart, this guy shows up from Jiangsu province, this business guy, and this is the guy who brings Ensha Tea and cooperatives kind of back together. Of course, he does that by starting a corporation. He shows up and he starts Rumbang, which is still the largest tea cooperative in the Ensha state. Makes all this money, basically making the myth of Ensha Yulu. He's the
The
guy
lost art.
who makes those advertisements who are like, here is the lost art. Here is this lost Tang Dynasty tea, 1,000 years of whatever, blah, 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 blah. He's the guy who really gets that go. And he does a fantastic job, by the way. He goes back and finds the same guy who Hua had found in the 90s and says, yo, dude,
Teach me the ways.
how about no, not that. Let's make a law. Let's make a law. Let's define what is and is not Ensha Yulu.
Wow.
You and me, we're gonna, and they did. They made the proposal, goes up to the government. Government stamps it, says yes. They now have decided what is and is not Ensha Yulu, and you'll be fined if you don't meet their standards. By the way, Tao Bao has been fined like 5 times. Because he sells Yulu and he doesn't go. They have this semi-public, semi-private organization called like the Ensha Yulu something association that enforces this, and you have to pay them. They're fucking, oh, sorry, forget my language. They're bandits. You have to go, you have to follow their standards. If you look now at the official list of like Ensha Yulu practitioners, they all have come through these like 2 guys, the old professor and this outside business guy. They are Ensha Yulu. They have decided what it is and is not. And even if you've been doing it for 50 years on your own, if you don't go through their club, if you don't follow their standards, you can get fined. Wow. You cannot call your thing Ensha Yulu anymore. So that's, no.
When did that come around? What year?
2005 or 6. He shows up, and the old Ensha Tea like state-run factory, which had been there in different forms since World War II, the KMT, they set up the first tea factory out there.
Wow.
And it kind of evolves into this socialist factory in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And they were in deep doo-doo by the early 2000s through classic mismanagement, people running off to private businesses, graft, what you name it. He comes in and he basically tries to buy it up, and he succeeds. And right as he buys up the old Bajau tea factory, he renames it Rumbang. And in one fell swoop, he also makes the law. And he starts investing to set up the educational apparatus that going forward, if you want to learn Yulu, you're going to go through us. You're going to go through this
smart guy,
elevated master. Yeah, he really is smart guy. And it works fantastically. And that puts Ensha on the map. Whereas Ensha before was honestly not even the #1 tea producer in Hubei. Because he did it at just the right time. They were called like Hubei Di Li Shicha, like the #1 in historical tea in Hubei. Not because they're the oldest, because they were the first to register. The first to get this terroir definition, like the eco label. You probably heard about elsewhere, right. The geo label.
Yeah.
Where like they basically, you define in legal terms where and how a tea is produced. They were the first to do that, I think, in Hubei, and they got all this provincial support. And,
now, here's a sharp question: the factory that was built in the tea factory in the World War II era, by the KMT, were they making steamed green tea?
They maybe were, and this is the subject of you heard when we were in Luan. The guy is just like, the Japanese, they stole our technology. They stole our steamed green tea from Ensha. Those rascals. Well, as it happens, there was steamed green tea production in this part of Hubei. There still is to this day steamed tea production next door in Yichang City. This one temple probably has a better claim than Ensha does on having like uninterrupted steam green tea production. Although nationally in China, in the Ming Dynasty, I'm sure you've told the podcast before, Ming Dynasty steam production kind of goes away, but it doesn't go away altogether. And in these isolated parts of Hubei, it continues.
Right,
So there
because
is
this
steamed tea.
the steamed production was more a semi kill green phase that was made for pressing the tea soft enough into bricks and cakes. And so you'd get this tea that's not shelf stable that will change in age, like as we see with Boer that undergoes that like partial shotching, and also arguably with the white teas. And so while yeah, maybe a lot of people think like, oh, the steamed way is the best way to kill the green while preserving the flavors, it was more just the old technology that never went away, right? Is kind of I think what we're seeing here in Hubei, right?
But back to your question here, which is
Mm.
a fantastic question. Like, okay, we know there was a tea that was sent to Beijing by the Lan family. And the Lan family, these are tea merchants from outside of Hubei who show up in Enshe in the mid-ish Qing dynasty, and they're sending tea to Beijing. Uh, we have known nothing about it being steamed. There's no evidence it was called Enshe Yulu or Yulu at all. But this same Lan family, a couple decades later, a couple hundred years later, forgive me, at the beginning of the Republican period, is still making tea. They're kind of getting out of the business, and they had a product called Yulu. The same Lan family that allegedly was sending tea to Beijing, still in business, and they have a product called Yulu. The name was different. Whereas today, the reason why it's confused with how do you say it? Gyokuro? Gyokuro in Japanese, like is because it has the same characters, right? Jade mist. That was not the case with the Lan family. They called it Yu Lu, like Jade Green. Jade Green was the name. Yu Lu, I should say. Jade Green was the name that they were using as a market, just a market brand. They were not saying they were the only steamed green tea. They just happened to be steamed, and they called it Yu Lu. A Japanese merchant shows up in the 1930s, and they want to do business. They bring over steaming equipment from Japan to what becomes the state-run factory, and they're like, hey, we make this tea in Japan. Check it out. Maybe we can do export business. Next year, war breaks out, but the equipment stays behind at that factory in Enshe, which is today at Bafeng Mountain. So, forgive me, Wufeng Mountain, just kind of south of the city. So, if you go there today, you can still see like the remnants of this old factory and production area. And that was the factory working. The Japanese people left the equipment there, and then later on, now online in China, you can see people saying, well, the Japanese stole from us. There's an argument to be made that it was stolen from Japan because the year after the Japanese leave, that factory changes the name of Jade Green to Jade Mist to match the Japanese counterpart, which is also steamed and does look kind of similar. So there's a much better argument that they kind of copied at least the name from Japan and maybe actually learned more about steaming from the Japanese. We have no archaeological remains of what steaming looked like here before the 1930s. Allegedly, it was happening. We don't know. There was this like party guy in Shannon who says that he remembers seeing steam pits, and there's some memory of a steam box, but like it's really hard to say when what we see as steam production today began.
That
Yeah.
that is amazing. Absolutely
By the way,
fascinating.
how do we know about the Lan family and their wonderful history? That professor who helped make the modern standard for Yulu in
Mm.
the 50s was a student here in Enshe. And as the story goes, he got to meet one of the last people in the Lan family who had got out of tea, and from them heard the story of how Yulu came about. So like it's all based on oral tradition, kind of sort of decades after the fact.
I feel like
Very
this is yeah, just one of those ancient tales where it's like the dying secret of like the last of the the last heiress of this of the family history of original steamed green tea whispers it to the new boss that's gonna come over and change the laws and like it's like
yeah.
so like Quadra meeting the guy and like Baishuring to him like becoming his apprentice and then it's like okay now I can make steamed
But the
green
guy
tea.
wrote the book on Yulu now. Like the two books that have been published by the China Agricultural Press were written by him. He is
Wow.
the guy for Yulu. He's on all the posters here. He's the guy. So that professor has been elevated now to like insane heights. Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks
that's
to that
and
book.
that's incredible because I just did a podcast on the creation of like the codification of like Chinese tea art, like the cha yi and the cha dao. And the fact that, it kind of left China, went to Japan, went to Taiwan and stuff like that, and then eventually has been brought back and kind of circles around like the Chaozhou Gongfu style, and then that Daibiao has been like implemented, like brought out to the rest of China, and they're like, okay, this is Chinese culture, but it's kind of a modern take on traditional culture and like very isolated cultures that they've kind of like blown out and expanded, and they've taken bits and pieces from Japanese tea history and Taiwanese tea culture and stuff like that, and they've just put it all together, like the Gongdao
They're
Bay,
the
like that.
reason now in Ensha, if you go to a fancy tea shop, they'll put Yulu in a gaiwan. They'll brew it that way, which to me seems insane and has no basis in the culture here. But
Right.
yeah,
And so we see this kind of like cultural exchange and this idea of like nation building concepts of like, okay, this has been around forever. And so that's where like the guy comes in with the law and says like, okay, this is what Ensure Yulu is, and this is what we need to do, and everyone who doesn't do it like this will be fined. The government's like, that's strong nation building. Stamp it. Like,
yeah. Well, it's like you certainly, and he changes the name. It was Yulu before. What does he do? He adds two characters.
Ensure.
Ensha Yulu. This is Ensha's. This belongs to you, Ensha. Ensha government, check it out. So yeah, it was very wise on his part.
Amazing. And so that's really cool. So that takes us down this whole avenue of tea production in the Ensha region, the structure of the people behind the tea production, from the collectivizations in the 60s, the death of that in the 90s, the beginning of the cooperatives, and then really the fuel behind it are these private enterprisers coming in, leasing up land quasi legally and being very
Yeah,
successful.
and that I think can be a perfect segue.
Mm,
Talk about the cooperatives for 1 second, then we'll get to Hefeng here. Because like
yeah.
I mentioned, I didn't finish my point. This corporation that came in and did this, Rumbang, really provides the impetus for everyone to get really excited about doing cooperatives out here in Ensha because they see his success. Rumbang going great, Huaja going great. More bosses want in, and in 2007, the government nationally says, okay, let's do cooperatives again. We're going to do PFCs now, professional farmer cooperatives. If you have 5 farmers who will sign a piece of paper and say they're a cooperative, and then you can add your name, the 6th person, the big boss, that's a co-op. So like,
Okay.
as long as at least 5 people in that, I think it's 80%. As long as you can keep that like ratio of like farmer to non-farmer, you can be a
Okay.
co-op. So these big corporations come in and they set up these basically shell cooperatives, some of them real. Uh, some are set up by corporations, some are set up as they are here in Hefeng by a village leader, Lo Xinping. Some are set up by an existing big household, like our existing Jiating Nongchang, existing family farm functionally. Now we're going to have a cooperative because this organizational structure has government support. You can get a discount on the equipment you buy. You can get loans more easily. The government has an easier time promoting you, right? Or said, hey, we're going to collectivize again. It's coming, it's coming. This is the second coming. Okay. Or at least for a moment, it seemed like they were going to present this as like, here's us reorganizing, bringing everyone back together to make farming viable. That's like 2010-ish in Ensha. That really kind of the ball gets rolling.
And
That's when
and this is and this is the idea that we saw behind a lot of these cooperatives, and why we initially thought, okay, this is why people are uh, cooperating, creating these organizations, because they can get subsidies, because they can get
sure.
loans and grants and money from the government for doing this. And so we came in, looked at it on its face, and we were like, okay, like this is how you get government money. Is that really true now, or did it change again?
There's been back and forth. So like there was a period where it looked like the government had said it, you know what, forget the cooperatives, we're doing Jiating Nongchang. Then you saw examples in Zhejiang where like, you know what, let's have like 10 Jiating Nongchangs, let's have like 10 family farms come together and make like one super cooperative. Then you had
Oh,
like all these cooperatives making cooperative alliances in Fujian and Zhejiang, and there was lots of bickering about what the direction was going to be. And where things are kind of settled now is they're happy with cooperatives, they're happy with family farms, and they're very interested with collectivization. But it's
okay,
a
interesting.
new, it's really new. So like
Yeah.
in Yantai, the city in Shandong province, 2017, 2018, the government there is like, these cooperatives are really not working. All this money is being spent, all these discounts are being given, and most of them are it's just not happening. There was some big national survey, and 2% were found to be actually operating according to the regulations. 2%
Ouch.
nationally. Um,
Ouch.
Disaster. So they're like, okay, maybe we should not be doing cooperatives. But also these household farms, they aren't doing too hot either when it comes to actually paying the farmers. They aren't really improving the livelihood of the farmers out here. So we're going to step in and make our collectively established cooperatives. Each village branch in Mayintai went out and they made a cooperative or 5 cooperatives, and they would work with the existing independent private cooperative or the independent household farm or corporation, whatever, Jiating Jia, so like collective plus whatever existing organization there is, and try to guide it in a way that they can actually enforce policies and actually make these people who are making money off farming share a bit more with the farmers who are, more marginally involved. So that kind of really takes off. And only this last year, has the government said, okay, this is what we're doing. We nationally want to have collectives take a bigger part of it. And then whatever you have, whatever manner of existing development exists, we're going to work with that. And Yindao, we're going to try to guide it in the direction we want. We want to have the political line of like, actually please develop agriculture, be pushed through. So that's kind of where we are today.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And so that brings us all the way up from, essentially the 60s when everything is collectivized to when it kind of breaks down in the 80s when they separate all the land, distribute it, and then the different ways that cooperatives, collectives have kind of fallen out of vogue, been dissolved and destroyed, and the people, the real skilled laborers behind that, the tea makers and whatnot, leaving to form their own private enterprises. And hopefully this means the legislation this year in Hubei is going to give cooperatives a little more government support, a little more backing, a little more justification. And so I think I'm going to cut the podcast right here, this episode at least, because we're already over an hour, and I usually don't go over 45 minutes or maybe 50 minutes at most. It's been a very exciting interview with Alex, and I'll save the rest of this little discussion for the next episode, where we talk about the particular details of what we are doing out in Hefeng County, historically one of the poorest counties in central China, with the Lo Shui Yuan Cooperative, and working with the villagers on the mountaintop to kind of revitalize the sense of solidarity, the sense of organic farming and success through cooperation, which, as we will see in the next episode, has taken a lot of hits in the last couple of years, and a lot of the farmers are disinterested in even continuing with the cooperative. And so it'll be really interesting to hear Alex's perspective of what's going on the mountaintop, and then our future plans on what we're going to be doing in Hefeng. So again, this is Derek from One River Tea. Thank you guys so much for listening to this really historical, information heavy podcast episode, but this is what we're really into. We're really into just looking at the really complicated truths behind the structure of these farming enterprises, companies, corporations, and cooperatives out in this area, because we hear people talk about, the tea farmer. What is a tea farmer? A tea farmer is often a collection of different people doing different tasks, sometimes in loose cooperation, sometimes in employment, worker-owner relationships. But what we're really interested in is in the cooperative. And so this is really exciting for us. This is our bread and butter. And so stay tuned for the next episode when we talk particularly about our land up on the Mayintai mountain, where Alex is currently voicing in, and we have some woofers out there right now. So until next time, keep that water hot and brew happy. Later.